This is a trigger warning. The following conversation on the book What Good Girls Do will touch on topics around rape and other acts of sexual violence during the discussion. These topics will appear from the outset of the conversation. So for those that could be triggered by these topics, I would advise to turn off now. This interview was recorded in 2018.
I've never felt this shaky and different before. My daddy rips my hair upwards really hard, so I throw my hand out and hit the bit of broken screen that's stuck in his head. Even though it hurts me, I think it hurts my daddy more. Daddy lets go of my hair. He wobbles and looks like he's going to fall down. He reaches up and touches the bit of screen in his head. As he does, I bend over like a good girl getting her tight ass fucked, but instead of getting fucked, I pick up the TV with both hands. It doesn't feel heavy at all when I lift it above me. My daddy makes his cum face again. I drop my arms. The TV hits his head really, really hard. It goes ksh! My daddy shouts, and then he stops shouting, and then he falls down with the TV still on his head.
She lives with no name. She has never left her room. All she has ever known is pain and abuse. Until now. Today, she will breathe fresh air for the first time, feel sunshine against her skin, and even witness human kindness. But she has a point to make. A bleak, violent point. And when she meets her neighbour Serenity, she finds the perfect pupil. Forced to endure a lesson distilled from a nightmarish existence, Serenity must face unflinching evil, witness the unspeakable, and question her most deeply held views, until at last she has no choice but to fight for her family's survival. What Good Girls Do was written by Jonathan Butcher and published by the Sinister Company in 2017. In this episode of Sinister Re, Justin Park chats with Jonathan about one of the publisher's most controversial titles. Hi, this is Justin from the Sinister Horror Company. I'm here with Jonathan Butcher, author of the extreme and brutal novel or novella What Good Girls Do. And we're here today to discuss the book in depth. And find out a bit of the motivations and the inspiration behind it. So, Jonathan, hello.
Hello.
How are you doing today? You good?
Yeah, I'm pretty damn good.
Excellent. Thanks for coming and talking about this book today. Now, What Good Girls Do, I'll put up front, is a very extreme story.
Extreme.
It's one of probably the Sinister Horror Company's most extreme titles.
Yeah, I was worried that it was too extreme, if you remember.
And I can understand that from the content, but it's also one of our biggest sellers. So there is a market out there for it. So I want to talk today about the book, find out some of your inspirations and motivations behind it. So first off, I'd just like to ask quite simply, why did you write the book?
It was a purging, really. I'm lucky enough to have never experienced anything too dreadful in my life. But I've known a lot of people who've been through some really unpleasant things. And I've written stories in the past where abuse and assault and sometimes rape have been on the periphery of the story. But I'd never tackled it quite as head-on as this. But the time was right, I guess. And I'd always wondered whether I should write something that was explicitly about sexual abuse and assault, because it is something that I feel obviously quite strongly about, having known a lot of people who've suffered. And the story just wrote itself in a lot of ways. I've never written a story so quickly and had it polished in such a short space of time as What Good Girls Do.
And how long did it take to write?
3 months from beginning to end. The first draft was done probably in a month. I think I was writing about 1,000 words a day. And that was with a full-time job and everything like that. And normally I'm not that productive. Or if I am writing 1,000 words a day, I'll be going back on the previous one and cutting it up and fiddling around with it and editing things. With that, I blasted it out, really, in a very short space of time.
And you were doing a full-time job at the same time as doing
Yeah,
this?
I was writing on my lunch breaks or writing in the morning before I went off to work. I wouldn't tend to write during the weekends, in fact. So yeah, it was a lot of writing during that time, and it felt like a story that I needed to tell, I guess.
And where did the inspiration come from?
I met someone who was a friend who was involved in the fetish community. And it wasn't something that I'd really thought much about in the past. And she used to describe some of the people who were involved in the scene. And while some of it sounded great for people who want to explore that side of their personalities, I got an impression that there was definitely a dark side to it, and that people weren't just there to explore their sexualities, but also as a form of therapy. And I also felt like some of the people that she talked about were at a tough point in their lives, who were very easily manipulated and exploited. And I heard the phrase baby girl and the other phrase daddy dom for the first time. And not in a kink shaming kind of judgmental way, but some of the stories that I heard associated like that sounded very much like prey and hunter, or abused and abuser. And I started to get a clear idea of the way that some women who call themselves baby girls speak and see the world. And with that, I developed the voice of girl, which is a very simplistic, childlike character who is much older than you might expect from the way that she phrases things and the way that she sees the world. And these insights, combined with films like Baise Moi, Bad Boy Bubby, Monster, a few of these other exploitation films that look at people who have suffered and the way that they then react explosively to that, combined with, again, my strong feelings towards people who have been abused and their abusers, all of this culminated in me writing the first 3 scenes in which girl features in a single lunch break, I think. They were eventually split into 3 separate chapters, I think chapter 1, 3 and 5. And it just flowed out of me. And it was an unrefined version of the voice that girl ended up having in the story. But essentially all of the main pieces were there on just after an hour's work at a lunch break. And yeah, took it from there.
Thinking about the storyline and then the book as the whole once you've completed it, you've already sort of touched on where the inspiration has come from. In the actual, as you were writing the book, was there any themes or messages that you were starting to consider and starting to explore?
Well, it certainly explores misogyny and the differences between 2 genders in certain scenarios and circumstances, generally in the context of an abusive scenario, and also the fetishized, I don't know how to phrase it. Basically, Serenity and her husband are in a fetish relationship, and I saw parallels between those and how those lines may blur at times if the wrong person was involved or a cruel, manipulative person was involved. I've kind of lost track of Of the themes you're asking about as well.
So that's a good point that you bring up. So Serenity and her husband are in they partake in some bondage in one of the first few scenes that we see of them.
Yeah.
And with that, are you running that as a parallel against what Girl has suffered from?
It started off as just being a plot device, and I wanted them to have this sense of rough play in their relationship, so that when Girl sees them, and they're actually the first couple that she has ever seen, because she's been in this basement for her entire life. All she's ever known is abusers. She's never seen another woman, and Serenity is the first woman that she ever sees or remembers seeing. And I knew that there had to be that rough side of them having sex for her to react in such a violent manner. But because it was then part of the overall plot, I sought to develop that. And I do worry that someone might read it and think that I'm making a comment on anyone who has ever indulged in kinky sex, and that's ridiculous. That's absolutely not what I'm doing at all. And I never intended it to be such a large part of the story and the underlying themes. But what started off as a plot device then became a reflection of the way that Serenity saw her marriage, because you never really learn a great deal about her husband outside of the sexual scenario and the way in which he responds to having been attacked. So yeah, it allowed me to explore the way that someone might end up being in a relationship for many years, and only when they look back and take a step back from what they're experiencing, wonder, am I actually being manipulated or treated, or being treated in ways that I really shouldn't be.
Looking at then, so the genesis of the story, and then you're actually sitting down and writing it. So thinking about the actual style of the book in itself, and some of the pacing and plot devices that you used, what would you say were your biggest influences in the book? Were there any other writers or films or any other medium that was inspiring you?
One of my absolute favourite authors and styles is Irvine Welsh, and the way that he doesn't just tell a story that features very, very different characters. He speaks in their voices. And I did that in the first novel that I ever finished, which has just been released, The Children at the Bottom of the Garden. But in What Good Girls Do, I took what I did there and took it even further. And I was very inspired by the idea of getting completely inside the heads of both of my lead characters, and trying to see the world and see everything through their eyes. As I mentioned before, other inspirations, apart from true life stuff, horrifying stuff like the Fritzl case, Bad Boy Bubby is an Australian exploitation comedy? I don't know. Drama? Horrible, fucked up, amazing film about a infantilized man who is kept apart from society for almost his entire life while he's being abused by his mum, and then how he responds to the outside world once he has dispatched his mum and her lover. So I wanted to combine that idea of seeing things that you've never encountered, never even imagined, maybe, and trying to envision the ways that a character like Bubby or my character Girl would interpret the world at large, but combine that with the brutality of something like Baze Noir, and the misandry, I suppose, because you could interpret it as being quite a man-hating book, but I guess you could also interpret it as being a warning against the logical conclusion of radical feminist thought. So I guess you could interpret it either way. So yeah, Baise Noire, which is kind of like the Thelma and Louise of extreme horror, where two sex workers, I think they're both prostitutes, are brutally raped and attacked, and then essentially just spend the rest of the film murdering men. I don't think a great deal of the film itself. I wanted to do that, but my way, and explore it through the eyes of someone who'd suffered the things that girl had, and also Monster and the film The Woman. I realise I'm listing films rather than books here, which doesn't make me look like a very good author, but yeah, Monster, the amazing Charlize Theron film about the serial killer. What's her name? Mia someone. And yeah, also, as I said, The Woman, definitely. That whole feral side to the character in The Woman, which is a film based on, what's his name? Jack Ketchum's book, The Woman, of the same name. And it's about a man who finds a feral woman in the woods one day, and because of his very twisted beliefs, takes her back to his family, and uses her as a project to try and teach her how to become less feral, less wild, and more domesticated, whilst simultaneously horribly abusing her, along with the rest of his family, which is pretty fucked up. But yeah, I would say that those were probably the four stories that inspired What Good Girls Do the most, I think.
Thinking about the actual writing of the book, then, I'm always curious to hear about how authors kind of approach their writing. So, with What Good Girls Do, did you have a plan in mind, and did you create a plan straight off and work from that plan, or did you just write it?
Essentially, I tried to write this book to give me a vehicle for committing psychic vengeance upon people who'd harmed some of the people that I love or have known and befriended in my life. So essentially, I just envisioned it as being a book where someone is mistreated, and then there's the revenge, which is essentially your typical rape revenge kind of drama. But I think that it became, for me anyway, something much more interesting than that. So while it started off as something quite simplistic, the further I got into it and the more that I got into Girl's head, the more that I realised that I wanted it to be about more than her own personal experiences, and to maybe pose some pretty disturbing questions about, I suppose, about men primarily, and the relationships that we often have with our lovers / sexual conquests, depending on how the man sees their relationship with the woman or their sexual experiences. So no, there was no overarching plan. I knew that I was going to explore Girl's first experiences in the outside world, and that she was going to wreak some pretty unpleasant violence against the innocent family next door, but I hadn't realised at that time that she was necessarily going to return to the house. And it was only when Girl and Serenity have returned and got to the basement room where Girl has spent her entire life that I realised that the other daddies were going to come back to the house, and that was going to form the basis of the climax of the story.
So you didn't have the climax planned out in your head at all?
No. Until
you were actually writing it?
No, absolutely not. And when I first started writing it as well, I had no idea that, spoiler alert, her mother had been living in the room next door for the entire time. The only reference to Girl's mother in the first draft originally was that she remembered another good girl, she called it, hugging her, but then she remembered her daddy making red stuff come out of her or something. So the suggestion was that her mum was dead. So again, it was only when I got to that later point that I realised that there would be a certain tragic poetry to the idea that, you know, for many, many years, probably since her early childhood, there's just been a wall dividing her hellish life, in which she's experienced is abuse and violent pornography. And then I didn't get to explore it, but the fact that her mother had actually been comparatively treated quite well, probably due to the horrible guilt that her real father has for the way that she's treated her.
So you mentioned the fact that the mother wasn't put in the first draft, and that was something that you put in later drafts. Was there any other things that you've added in or taken out from the first draft?
Well, I mean, we were saying earlier, most of it was pretty much there the first time that I wrote it. The only difference that I clearly remember, and when I was revisiting the first draft the other day, was that the very final scene when Serenity is racked by post-traumatic stress, and also she suffered the head injury, which I think has scrambled her brain in some awful way. In the final version, she has separated her two twins, her male and female son and daughter, and locked the son away in a cupboard where he is just being kept, you know, quite obvious parallel to the way that Girl has been kept away, but for different reasons. But she had actually performed her own amateur surgery on the poor sod, and removed his penis and actually made him into a little girl in the original version. But after I had a few beta readers read it, in fact I'm not even sure if they read that version, I decided I didn't want to make the ending quite so definite, and it's already, according to some reviewers, been a bit too much for people to swallow, that final scene. Even though the weeks had gone by, when you read it, the very last thing that you saw was her emerging from the house, essentially, or passing out on the day of the violence. So yeah, I tried to make it slightly more ambiguous, because she's already doing a terrible, terrible thing. I don't think the extra added awfulness of her castrating her child and literally turning him into a girl was necessarily needed. But everything else was pretty much the same. The redrafts were just a case of refining Girl's voice, making sure that the words that she saw as being most significant were all capitalised and repeated, and that I didn't include references to any concepts or things that she may or may not have encountered in her very, very narrow life down in the basement. But yeah, plot-wise, it was pretty much the same as the first time I wrote it.
You talk about Girl's voice and refining that, and in the way that you've structured the book and the story is you have one chapter which is Girl, and it's spoken through her, and then the next chapter is Serenity, and it's spoken with her voice and seeing it from her side, and then the book swaps between the two each time as it goes along. Eventually they meet up, and then the story progresses like within that way. Now these two are very, very different voices, so I was wondering, when you wrote them, you said that you wrote the first 3 Girl chapters in one go and split them up. Once you'd split those up, did you write each chapter separately, or were you writing blocks of Serenity and blocks of Girl?
I realised quite soon that the whole story, apart from the final 2 chapters, was going to take place on the same day, and I really made it my aim with this book to end every chapter, not necessarily with a cliffhanger, but with a new insight or a new observation or a new event that would compel the reader, hopefully, to then start the next chapter almost immediately. It's almost written to be read all in one go. So yeah, while I was writing it, I did alternate between the two. It was only after that first 3 scenes that I wrote that I then introduced Serenity's character, popped her to first 2 chapters in between those other ones that I'd originally written, and then I passed between both of them as I was writing it. Girl Serenity, Girl Serenity.
And how did you recapture the voice? So if you're writing in one character, and then you're going back into the other, how did you get back into that character?
In a way, Girl's voice is a lot more carefully developed for her character than Serenity, because it's, if you have 2 adults speaking or thinking, presumably, they're obviously going to be different, and they have different turns of phrases, different words that they might use, different opinions that they might express. But the similarities between 2 adults of similar backgrounds and similar jobs, say, would be much closer than when you compare Girl's voice and mindset to an adult's. So because it was so different, Serenity in some ways is almost written in my own voice. The opinions not so much, and there were certain ways that she saw things, but hers is a more traditional storytelling voice, whereas Girl's was so simplistic that the real challenge came in the refining rather than just the simplicity of her original scenes. So I'm not really sure how I could say how I switched between the 2. It was just, it flowed so naturally, and I felt like I knew Girl's voice so well after just a few scenes of having written her that it just flowed quite naturally, I think.
Everything in the book is, as you're talking about it now, it's very well thought out. You know, everything is kind of is playing in your head. There's a particular reason for things like the capitalisation in certain elements. So one thing I'd like to sort of touch on is the naming of the 2 main characters, Serenity and Girl. Now, those names particularly were chosen with thought, and I wondered what the thought was behind them.
I actually had criticisms for Serenity's name, as if I was trying to say something more with it. But the absolute honest truth is that it's a pretty name, and I wanted her to have a uniqueness to her name, and I didn't just want her to be Sarah, Sharon. I wanted it to be something slightly more than that, but there wasn't really any specific reason for naming her something that means serene and tranquil, because I mean, I suppose you could compare her to the, you know, suburban dream, and you could say that it's a tranquil life compared to the trauma of Girl's life, but that isn't actually true. It was just a name that was quite unique, whereas Girl, her real name is Elizabeth, you later come to learn, but being simply referred to as Girl is just dehumanizing in some way. Not, maybe that's not the right word, but not allowing her to have her own character, because the way that she's been always treated is that she is simply there to provide pleasure to men, and not just those who abuse her, such as her father and the other daddies that you later meet in the story, but also those who are viewing her. There are hundreds of thousands of subscribers, the vast majority of which are men, who subscribe to the not necessarily live feed, but the videos that her so-called daddies upload of her being brutalised and assaulted on the net. So breaking her down to the absolute bare bones of her physiology felt quite a powerful statement to make, I suppose, and also added impact to the fact later on when she's actually called Elizabeth and you realise, wait a minute, that there could be a lot more to this person than the awful things that we've seen happen to her.
It goes without saying throughout this conversation that what Good Girls do is got a lot of dark content to it, a lot of troubling content. So I'm interested in, as you were writing it, when you have to explore that in your own mind. So when you stopped writing it each day, you're writing on your lunch breaks, you're writing it before work. were you able to switch off as soon as you turned your computer off to get back on with your normal life, or did you have any of these dark thoughts around you, and how did you separate those from getting on and interacting with people normally throughout the day?
Well, I mean, I have twisted thoughts all the time. Not that twisted, but I'm a horror writer, and I'm always talking about fucked up things. But as I said, even though it was quite a relief when I was able to wash my hands of it and no longer be a part of the What Good Girls Do universe on a daily basis, at the same time, it was definitely a purging. For a long time, I've had concerns and anger and hatred for those who abuse and mistreat people. And the absolute worst thing about it is the frequency that this stuff happens. The recorded rates of sexual assault and abuse and rape are infinitely lower from what I can tell, and everything I've read and all of the people that I've spoken to. It's terrifyingly common. I mean, I've known someone who wasn't locked up in a basement, but who experienced similar things in some ways to what girl experienced. So to finally be able to just vomit this stuff out into a story was like taking the plug out and letting all of this shit flow down the sink. So yeah, while I wasn't constantly thinking about it, it certainly preyed on my mind, but in a lot of ways, through such an ugly story, something quite positive happened for me, because I was able to let some of it go.
You mentioned earlier talking about you use beta readers for some of your earlier drafts. I'm just curious about, I mean, even the opening few stanzas are very, very powerful, and I just wondering what your beta readers thought of this and the story as a whole. What kind of comments were you getting back?
I had 3 main beta readers, 2 men, 1 woman. One of the men wasn't sure if he wanted to finish it. He got about halfway in and he said, "I'm just finding this terribly upsetting." And I said, "If you don't want to read it, it's fine. It's very, very strong content." But he said he felt strongly enough about it to finish it. And when he got to the final scene featuring Girl, he said he cried, which made me think I was really doing something right. There must have been something there. And while he said he didn't enjoy it, he praised the book. He thought that it was well put together. The other guy said that while it was awful subject matter, he thought that the pacing was great, and he quite enjoyed it. The woman said that, and I quote, "It was like something an angry 14-year-old girl would write when she had first discovered feminism." And that was the first response I got from a woman, which made me think, oh dear, what have I done? I've royally fucked this up. This is the clumsiest piece of shit. And yeah, I really had to reconsider and reevaluate what I thought of this piece of work. Thankfully, that wasn't the overriding opinion when I allowed another couple of women to read it, and they gave me a bit more positive feedback. But yeah, this was a very close friend, and she certainly wasn't saying it to offend me. I think perhaps part of it might have been because she'd never read my stuff before, and she thought that I was just going all out to shock. And while my writing often hovers on the fringes of extreme, I've never written anything like What Good Girls Do before, and hopefully I'll never write anything as extreme as that again. The other interesting part of letting people read it for the first time were their reactions to the opening page, the book. And I personally saw someone read those first 7 lines, and it ruined her entire day. And I mean, we were at the horror convention, and we were basically saying to people who asked about the book, if you can read the first 7 lines, then, you know, it might be for you. If not, that's the test. So it was like the 7-line test, and you yourself said that you've seen people
Yeah.
react quite strongly to it. So I guess that was the other side of it, and it made me think, is this too extreme? And you know, we talked a lot about it before, you and I, before it was published, whether we were going to include a warning on it, or I mean, yeah, I was genuinely concerned that I'd written something that was unpublishable. I think that it covers things in there that I've never really read about. Even books like American Psycho, because I'd never read Edward Lee at this point. They were graphic and they were vile, but they didn't involve children as some of this stuff did. And my absolute worst fear was that someone was going to read this book and misinterpret it as being me just trying to be as vile as possible and maybe even getting off on it. And thank fuck no one has accused me of that yet.
That's one thing that I was very aware of when I first read it. Was one thing that I wouldn't have ever touched it with is if you began to eroticize any of it. The fact that none of the abuse was eroticized, as I was reading it, meant okay, this has a point and it has a message, and it's not stepping over that line. Was that something that you were aware of when you were writing it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a huge extreme horror fan. I like some of it, and I'm completely for free speech, so this isn't me being judgmental. Anyone should write whatever the hell they like, and it's fine. But I do think that there is quite a lot of careless scenes that feature sexual violence, and generally the reader is either a passive observer or they're in the head of the person committing the offence, or they're in the head of the person being abused. This is rare, but even when they are, there's a lot of references to the anatomy and what they're wearing and how attractive they are. They're always stunning people who are just ripe for sexual assault, and it's just unrealistic, and I would never want to be responsible for writing something that eroticized something as horrifying as abuse or rape. So I didn't want the reader to be an observer, just standing at the side watching awful things happening. I wanted it to be within that person's head. I wanted to put that person in the mindset of girl, and to be experiencing the trauma rather than committing it or voyeuristically watching it. So yeah, I thought about that quite a lot, I guess.
Okay, so once you've written the book, you've got your feedback from your beta readers, and then you completed it all. At that point from there, the next bit I want to talk about is the book as the whole, as the package. I mean, there's more to a book than just the writing. That is 90% of it. But then we've got the way that it's laid out, and we've got the cover and those sort of things. So I want to sort of discuss that, and actually, if you could go through sort of how the cover came about, where the ideas came from, and how it progressed.
Yeah, I didn't write the book imagining it was ever going to be published, and I didn't write the book envisioning the possible packaging or anything like that. So it was only afterwards that I really considered it. And I consider the book to be, in a lot of ways, a very sad book, even though it doesn't dwell on people sobbing or anything like that. It's about post-traumatic stress, and it's about the awful psychological trauma that such things can wreak on a person. So I didn't want like an exploitation flick kind of cover with loads and loads of bloodshed and lots of dramatic things taking place. I either wanted it to appear quite childlike and innocent, which we ended up having on the back with the picture book that girl is drawing in her room, featuring Skinny Daddy and Cigarette Daddy. But I wanted it to be a much more somber, melancholy look, and I guess the key part of the entire story, really, the hook, is the fact that we have this character who has never left her room, and then she does. So I thought it'd be cool to try and capture that first moment when girl sees real sunlight. So I didn't quite know how we would capture that. My girlfriend's a good photographer, and I talked about this with her, and we came up with the idea of the girl pulling back the doorway, and I thought it'd be cool if you could see that there was a knife there as well, to suggest the sort of violence that takes place in the story. I told a few friends, and thankfully, a very good friend of mine was willing to pose for it. Now, because girl spends almost the entire book buck naked, the front cover had to reflect that as well. So we spent a day with my girlfriend taking pictures of my friend as I waited in the other room, so I could give her privacy. Yeah, Sean certainly didn't mind seeing her like that. But so yeah, I would pop back out when my friend was covered up once again, and look at the photos that they'd come up with, and add my 5 pennies and say, why don't you try it with this? Why don't you add that kind of angle? And yeah, it was I thought a really successful shoot. And then on top of that, I drew, or in fact, I think Sean may have drawn, my girlfriend, the imagined picture book that girl did, and we included that on the cover, the back cover. Initially, we were going to write the entire blurb on the back, surrounded by childish items and also violent items like the knife and the handcuffs, but also like discarded pencils and things like that appear in the book. But the photo just wasn't quite good enough for that. And then, yeah, we fired it your way, and your guy Vince added his magic. The first version I thought looked really cool. The first rendering of it that you came up with was like molten metal, fiery colours, and suggesting great explosive violence and things like that. And while I thought it looked great, I don't think it fit the tone and the mood that I wanted to put across. And then you sent back the version with the muted colours, and I just absolutely loved it. Loved everything about it. And was it just the visuals you wanted to talk about? Because I guess there was also the quotes.
Yeah, by all means. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so not only did we include the book and the cover in our thoughts of how we wanted to wrap it up, but there are also quotes. And I knew I wanted to start with some kind of quote, but I didn't want to include it if it seemed meaningless. And I was also worried that if I included the Donald Trump quote that was on there, it would either be taken as a political statement, which it doesn't matter whether I lean left or right, it's not a political book. But I also didn't want it to seem, once again, exploitative and playing down the seriousness of the themes that are involved. To compare the Nietzsche quote, which is, if I just get to it here, to live is to suffer, to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering, which is a beautiful, eloquent, but very, very tragic line. And then to compare that with Trump's quote, "You can do anything, grab them by the pussy." I loved the comparison of the two of those, so we decided to include that as the opening to the book.
And we also talked about earlier we were discussing whether or not to put a warning on the book. That was a discussion that kind of went back and forth because of the nature of the book. We decided in the end to go against that, didn't we? Because we thought it might look like a marketing tactic more than anything else. So do you want to discuss on what it was that we did come up with that was a kind of a little nod on the cover as to what might be inside?
Yeah, well, we spoke to our mutual friend and acquaintance, Alex Davis, of the Film Gutter, which is the exploitation film reviewers section of the excellent Ginger Nuts of Horror website. So I've spoken to Alex numerous times, and we decided to if anyone was qualified to read and comment on such an extreme book, it would be Alex Davis. So he sent it off to him, and he fired us back some quotes. And I'm not quite convinced that the quote on the front really does spell out how extreme the book is, but it's a great quote, and it certainly lets people know that they're in for a pretty harsh read as a result of it. But yeah, like you said, the last thing that we wanted was to plaster it with, "This is the most extreme book you will ever read," because it cheapens it, and I didn't want that at all, and I certainly didn't want people to think that we were reveling in it. If we had done that, it would have come out because of genuine concerns for people reading a book and not being prepared for it, rather than trying to big up the fact that we're so extreme and nasty.
And then, so we got the book, it's all completed, it's all ready to go, it's just about to be published, and I'm curious to know how your feelings were just before it was going to go live to a public that you don't know, to readers you've never met before, who wouldn't necessarily have known your name, you hadn't released that many short stories within that time. So how were you feeling about it?
By that point I was pretty excited. I had considered using a pseudonym because I had visions before it was published of future potential employers finding out that I wrote stories, clicking on the look inside link for What Good Girls Do, reading the first 7 lines, and just immediately scratching me off the list. So I got past that, and by then I was just really excited to be having a piece of work that I was so proud of, the whole package proud of being released, and just hoping that people enjoyed it. The first review that it got was absolutely not positive. It started off with, "This is the very first pre-order that I regret." So yeah, there was nerves at that point, thinking, "Oh dear, is everyone just going to despise this amateurish nonsense?" But then thankfully that was quickly followed up by some positive reviews, and some of which really hit the nail on the head, saying things that made it quite clear that they'd understood my intentions. So yeah, but by then again I was no longer nervous, and I just thought, well, it's written now, it's published, let's see what people think of it.
So you talk about the first reactions that came out. The first one, I don't think I read that review straight away, but obviously you were probably monitoring the reviews as they came in.
Yeah, every day.
And yeah, it's a lesson, don't always read reviews. Don't read the bad ones. But so then it comes out and you start to get some feedback from it. So can you explain a little bit more then about the actual reaction that the book has got and has continued to get?
I think generally it's been pretty positive. Even though I was worried that it was too extreme, and I didn't know if people would gather what I was trying to do with it. A lot of people then reviewed it on Goodreads and Amazon and some of the other ones, and yeah, they were very praising towards it. I actually got a coveted 10 out of 10 from DLS Reviews, which was that was actually really exciting for me, because this wasn't someone who I'd ever interacted with before. The best kind of positive review is when it's someone who absolutely owes you nothing, and they get something from your work that drives them to really take a deep dive into that story, and say what the experience that they got from it. And in that review he said something like, if there hadn't been some kind of glimmer of resolution at the end of the book, I wouldn't have been able to go to work that day. And that blew me away. And another one from Chad Clark, he said something like this: some books, what was it?
He described it as a piece of art.
Yeah, something like that. And he said it doesn't give a damn about your expectations, it just is. And I thought, yeah, I didn't necessarily write it considering the responses. I wrote it for my satisfaction. And yeah, by that point, I was quite excited. And even if I got negative reviews after that, I'd already had some people who'd understood my intentions, and no one had accused me of being a deranged monster or pervert as well. So that was also positive.
And you mentioned the DLS review. That was the first time Sinister Horror Company got a 10 out of 10, 10 skulls.
Fantastic.
We got close, but never a 10 before. And I am reminded the final quote, I think, from his review was something along the lines of saying, "There is no pleasure to be had from this book."
Yeah, which is kind of a compliment, but and I understand, and it's exactly the intention of the book. It's not supposed to be a pleasing journey. It's supposed to be satisfying, I guess. But yeah, I didn't want people to enjoy it from any normal sense.
And that sums up the kind of reaction of the book. In one hand, you're getting a 10 out of 10, and on the same review, it's ending saying there is no pleasure to come from this book. Two polar opposite extremes, almost, in understanding the book. And do you think that many people have understood that and have got that? And have you seen that as a compliment in your writing?
Oh, definitely, yeah. So, some of my favourite pieces of art, again, it's films generally speaking, are ones that I am not very likely to revisit. The film Irreversible, which we were talking about earlier, Gaspar Noé's film, I have watched that once, and it's one of the most disturbing cinematic experiences that I've ever had, and I don't think I'll ever watch it again, but it's an absolute 10 out of 10 film. Other ones that I have seen subsequently more times, like Antichrist and Martyrs, I would also describe in the same way. I would say that Martyrs is a masterpiece, but there's no enjoyment to be had from it. It's not like watching a pleasing film. It's just masterful. And I'm certainly not saying my book's that word, but I can totally understand why someone would give something a very positive review, but also say that it's not an enjoyable experience, because I feel the same about some of my favourite pieces of art.
And then, so since releasing the book, you've got the reaction from people. You can see that some people are getting it, some people aren't, but it is kind of provoking some kind of reaction, like you're saying. Then from there, and from your career after What Good Girls Do as a writer, how have people approached you since, or spoken to you since? Are you known as the person that for What Good Girls Do, or they see you for other bits and pieces as well?
I think I'm not known, but from the people who have heard of me, most of the people who have referred to me in that way have been more likely to say, "You're the guy who did the shit demon, aren't you?"
That's the answer to the chocolate man, right?
Yeah. So most of them, I think, even though that's only a short story, I think that's probably a more memorable concept than What Good Girls Do. But there are certainly other people who have heard about What Good Girls Do. In fact, one of my most pleasing moments of being an author was when I did the very egotistical thing of searching for Jonathan Butcher horror on Google, and someone had recommended What Good Girls Do on a Reddit thread where the question was something like, this is a very vague request, but tell me about books to depress myself with. And among this list of all sorts of very, very well-respected names, someone had suggested What Good Girls Do. So that was quite a cool little moment as well. I've had a couple of people say, "Do you think you'd ever write a sequel for it?" And unless I had a really strong reason to return to that world, I don't think so. But who knows? If an idea ever popped into my head and I thought that demands to be written, it would have to be as much of a compulsion as the first one was, and that's going to take some doing, definitely.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for being with us
No
chatting about What Good Girls Do. I know it's a very dark and heavy book, so I do appreciate the fact that you had to talk about some things that were a bit dark and heavy in the process of it, but we do appreciate
no
it.
fart jokes, no dick jokes in this podcast. It was all grimness.
Well, that'll come for the chocolate man. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you very much.
No problem, thank you.
What Good Girls Do by Jonathan Butcher is available on paperback, Kindle and audiobook. The audiobook can be found on Audible. The Kindle can be purchased from Amazon, and the paperback can be found through most book retailers including Waterstones, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and directly through us at our website sinisterhorrorcompany.com. Thank you for listening. Being an independent publisher, we are just like you. We share the same passion, the same love for horror fiction. We believe in the incredible work being created, unnoticed by the mainstream. And we want to share it with the world. We are the Sinister Horror Company.